Sling and Things.
Sup everyone, and welcome back to Sling and Things. Today I am reviewing a biography about an obscure world leader from the antebellum period, because that's how I roll. But before I get to that, I want to take a second to acknowledge that the previous episode of Sling and Things blew up and did infinitely better than I thought it would when I was making it. It got like 1,000 times more views over its first 24 hours than episode 7, which was vindicating because I was sort of apprehensive about posting that at all. Episode 8 was pretty different from the previous 7 episodes, and I thought it might do well, but I was also worried that it might be too different, or that people might think it was too weird or specific or whatever. And the reality is that you never know what will click with people. And I just want to say, at the risk of being incredibly schmaltzy, that if you're watching this, and if you're an artist, or a writer, or a musician, and if you have some kind of project that you really want to make that's been percolating in your head forever, but that you're having trouble starting because you're always wondering, like, what if no one else likes it? What if it turns out that this thing you want to make has zero mass appeal and that you will have just made this for yourself? I will simply say to you, you should forget about all that and block out your doubts and make your passion project anyway. Bet on yourself. Which, of course, is way easier said than done, but seriously, go for it. You will never be certain if the thing you want to create will connect with an audience before you actually make it. So you might as well not even worry about it and pursue what you want to pursue. Your main objective should be to create something that you yourself are proud of, no matter how niche it might be. It should be to create something that you yourself find value in, and that more than anything, you want to create, that you want to put out into the world. Because that way, even if you make something, and even if no one else gets what you were going for, in the end, you still will have created something that matters to you. You still will have managed to bring your self-expression to life. And that's a really cool accomplishment that no one can ever take away from you, even if no one else winds up knowing about it. And the more you do that, the more you experiment, the more art you put out into the world, and the better you'll get at it. And you can only get better if you take that first step and put aside your doubts and just go for it. Or, to quote the most famous line from Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, it's a leap of faith. And that's kind of what this video is too. This is a more conventional episode than the last one, but the subject matter is equally, weird. Today I am discussing a person that maybe no one else besides me cares about. It's entirely possible that I am alone in my interest about this figure, and that my video will be a dud. And if it is, that's not ideal, but I can live with it because this guy is interesting to me, and I want to make a video about him. I've actually wanted to do something on him for a while, and that's what matters more than anything. This is the 9th episode of Sling and Things, which I think gives me enough of an excuse to review a book about the 9th President of the United States of America, which I will now do. Today I am reviewing William Henry Harrison, the American President Series, The 9th President, 1841, by Gail Collins. If you've never heard of William Henry Harrison, you are forgiven because he is among the most obscure of all the American presidents. He is one of several early presidents who got in and didn't dramatically change the country, and that history has more or less forgotten. You are not obligated to know who William Henry Harrison is by any means, and I myself would have had no interest in reading about this guy had he not died in office just 31 days into his presidency, which is incredibly interesting to me, because he's the answer to a multitude of trivia questions. The fact that the United States once had a president who only had the job for a month is wild to me. He didn't sign any bills, he didn't veto anything, he didn't do anything. It's like his presidency never happened. And once you factor in how he died and why he died, you will understand why I was eager to check out this book about him. And plus, there's so little to know about Harrison compared to the other presidents that in theory, you really only need to read one book about him to become an expert on him, whereas it's significantly harder to be a completionist on Washington or Jefferson or Lincoln, aka presidents who did stuff. I read this with the anticipation that if nothing else, I would be able to claim that I now knew everything there was to know about at least one of the US presidents, even if he was a random one. So the first thing to know about this book about him is that it's really, really short, as in you could absolutely knock this out in a weekend if you wanted to, which makes sense given that his presidency didn't exactly produce a ton of moments to write about, but this was still shorter than I imagined it would be, and I would argue shorter than it needed to be. More on that later. The first half of this book is about Harrison's early life and his rise to political prominence. And I gotta be honest, I had trouble getting through this first part of the book for a couple reasons, neither of which have anything to do with Gail Collins' writing ability because she's a very good writer. For one thing, Harrison was by no means an underdog figure. His family was very affluent. His father had been the former governor of Virginia and was one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. And one of Harrison's grandchildren, Benjamin Harrison, later became the 23rd president of the United States. So it's not like William Henry Harrison came out of nowhere to have his political career. His story is not all that humbling or compelling, which made it difficult for me to get invested in his origin story. He was also pretty loaded for most of his life. For instance, this is how Collins described his living situation when he was 27 years old in the year 1800. In a region full of humble wood frame houses, sod huts, and log cabins, William Henry built his family a brick mansion, 2 stories high with 13 spacious rooms, 4 large chimneys, carefully hand-carved woodwork, and an imposing semicircular staircase. Everything about it was imported from outside, including the workmen from Ohio and Pennsylvania who were brought in to build it. Harrison sold 400 acres of land just to raise enough money to buy the bricks. In an era where very few Americans had windows that were anything but holes covered by wooden shutters, Harrison bought window glass from England, an order that took 2 years to fill. His mansion quickly became the territorial equivalent of a tourist attraction. No one in Vincennes had ever seen anything like it. It was the sort of place that its inhabitants christened with a name, and Harrison called his home Grouseland, which parenthetically I think is a really dumb name for a house. The other aspect about Harrison that made reading about him difficult is that Harrison was not a great dude. It isn't just that he owned slaves, which he did. He was born on a plantation in Virginia. It's that he was an army general who got renown by chasing Native Americans off their homeland and swindling them with purposely lopsided deals. The most notorious battle of his career was the Battle of Tippecanoe, in which he squashed an Indian rebellion and pretty much crushed whatever dream the natives ever had of living on equal standing with their white invaders, as it allowed the U.S. Army to expand their territory even further westward. Needless to say, this makes it hard to relate to Harrison. I mean, I wasn't so naive that I went into this without anticipating that Harrison's legacy might be muddied, but man, did he have a lot of blood on his hands. He is directly responsible for both Indiana and Illinois becoming slave states, which is really bad. Although it does make the end of this book a little brighter. The Battle of Tippecanoe was such a boon for Harrison that people gave him Tippecanoe as a nickname. They called him Old Tippecanoe. Other points of interest, since I'm recapping his life, are that he was the first governor of Indiana Territory. He became a representative and a senator from Ohio. He fought in the War of 1812, blah, 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 blah. Anyway, his life story wouldn't get really interesting until the 1830s, when he's in his 60s and when he decides that he's going to run for president as a member of the Whig Party, the WHIG Party, which was a precursor to the Republican Party. Abraham Lincoln, for example, was a Whig before he was a Republican. Harrison ran for president in 1836. It doesn't pan out because there's a bunch of other people running from the Whig Party and they all cannibalize each other's support. But he runs as the lone Whig Party candidate in 1840, and he goes up against the Democratic candidate, Martin Van Buren, who was the incumbent president of the United States. and who naturally was seeking re-election. The 1840 election is what's most remembered about Harrison as a politician, outside of his untimely death, and it became a famous race because it set the template for many future American elections. It demonstrated that it's possible to become president with splashy gimmicks and a loud populist message, even if that message isn't legitimate. So, the big turning point in the race was when a Democratic newspaper ran a hit piece that tried to slander Harrison by saying that he wasn't fit for the job, that he's just doing this for the paycheck. Hell, he'd settle for a log cabin and some hard cider if you gave it to him. And the Whig people saw that piece and they were like, well, damn, let's spin this. And they did. Harrison spent the entire presidential campaign using the symbolism of a log cabin and hard cider to try to paint himself as a man of the people, as a man who came from humble origins, from a log cabin, and who wasn't one of those fat cats in Washington who looked down on people for drinking hard cider, unlike Martin Van Buren. And that message was not at all supported by the facts, because again, Harrison grew up in a much wealthier environment than Van Buren. He was much more of an aristocrat than him. But it didn't matter because his campaign was so adept at spreading the image of him as a man of the people that people bought it. People were like, yeah, this guy sounds awesome. I'm sure he cares about us. He drinks cider. That's gotta account for something. The other thing that Harrison's campaign did was that they made his campaign into a big party. This was the first presidential campaign to really get people involved in it and to turn the whole thing into this giant public spectacle. They passed out free bottles of beer to people, bottles that were in the shape of log cabins. They came up with songs about Harrison and his running mate, John Tyler, which they would then get supporters to sing. They even created giant balls made of tin and paper, which had slogans on them, and which they would then roll into towns. And because this was happening in the year 1840, when television and the radio and the internet and most sports didn't exist and people were bored, this was really extravagant to them. It was really exciting to see a bunch of people roll a huge ball into town that had information about William Henry Harrison on it. And in the end, it all worked to perfection for him. William Henry Harrison crushed Martin Van Buren that fall, winning 234 electoral college votes to Van Buren's 60, although the popular vote was considerably closer. So, Harrison was elected president, and an aging president at that. He was 68 years old when he took office, which made him the oldest president ever at the time, a distinction he would hold until Ronald Reagan was elected president. And however old you think 68 is now, it was ancient back in 1840, when the life expectancy for an American man was like 40. And his Democratic opponents had tried to use his age against him by painting him as doddering and decrepit and senile. And Harrison wanted to shove it in their faces. He wanted to show that he really had the stamina for this job, which is why, when he was inaugurated on a frigid day in March, he rode to the ceremony on a white horse without a coat or a hat or gloves on. And then, in the cold, he delivered an 8,445-word inaugural address that took him 1 hour and 45 minutes to recite. It is still easily the longest inaugural address ever uttered. And when he was finished with it, he then went and attended several inaugural balls to really hammer home that he was fine, he was healthy, he had all the energy he would ever need. And his message would have been well delivered, except that a few weeks later, he was out walking in the rain, and he caught a cold, and he fell ill, and he was then diagnosed with pneumonia. And just 31 days after swearing in, he passed away, becoming the first president to die in office and the first to end their term prematurely. Now, here's where this book disappointed me. The main reason I was reading this to begin with was because I wanted to know all the juicy details about how Harrison died and what the aftermath was. Because the way the doctors tried to save his life, in retrospect, was ridiculous. They gave him opium. They gave him wine and brandy. They put blisters on his body. They gave him enemas. They gave him mercury and ipecac. They gave him castor oil and petroleum. And it's even been written that in a last-ditch, desperate effort to save his life, the doctors resorted to using leeches on him and/or live snakes, which is amazing. And today, it is widely presumed that not only did the doctors not help Harrison with any of that, it's presumed that their care probably made him much worse. And that was what I was hoping this book would have gone into great detail about, except it doesn't. This book gets to Harrison getting sick, and then it just ends a couple pages later. It goes into almost no specifics about how it was that he died. And to me, that was a gargantuan letdown, because the most interesting thing about Harrison, in my opinion, is his death. The lore of learning more about it was the main reason why I was reading this in the first place. And yet, the book almost immediately ends the second Harrison falls ill, which was baffling to me. This is an otherwise well-written book, and in the spirit of fairness, I should note that Harrison is not an easy figure to research, at least compared to the other presidents. Gail Collins did the legwork and properly converted Harrison's life into an even-handed, easy-to-read package, which is commendable. But it also comes across that Collins, who was a New York Times writer, may have been busy when she was writing this, and maybe moved on to other stuff the moment she got to Harrison's death. Like, have you ever had a school assignment where you had to type a certain number of pages, and the moment you reached the finish line, like the moment you got to page 10 or whatever, you instantly stopped and you were like, I am done with this, I have met my requirements, I am not writing any more of this. Well, that's what the end of this biography feels like. It is noticeably abrupt in its conclusion. And while I can still recommend this to someone who's specifically interested in William Henry Harrison, I must concede there really isn't much about his death here that you can't also find online in a singular article about him. So keep that in mind. Or don't. And it's a shame she didn't do more digging into Harrison's demise, because if she had, there's a chance that she could have uncovered something remarkable. For many years, it was taken at face value that William Henry Harrison had died of pneumonia, that by standing outside in the freezing weather without any extra layers, he had, in an act of hubris, made himself susceptible to sickness and brought death upon himself. It's a hell of a narrative, but believe it or not, an even better one emerged in 2014, just 2 years after this book came out. That year, a writer and a researcher at the University of Maryland School of Medicine combed through the notes that Harrison's doctor had written, and they determined that while Harrison may have had pneumonia, it was more likely than not that he had really died of enteric fever, and that what had killed him wasn't standing out in the cold, it was drinking water that had been contaminated with human fecal matter. Here's what they wrote in the New York Times. In those days, the nation's capital had no sewer system. Until 1850, some sewage simply flowed onto public grounds a short distance from the White House, where it stagnated and formed a marsh. The White House water supply was just 7 blocks downstream of a depository for night soil, hauled there each day at government expense. That field of human excrement would have been a breeding ground for 2 deadly bacteria, Salmonella typhi and S. paratyphi, the causes of typhoid and paratyphoid fever, also known as enteric fever, for their devastating effect on the gastrointestinal system. In other words, William Henry Harrison may have been done in by ingesting the poop-infested liquid that had seeped into the White House's water supply. Who says history has to be boring?